The Arizona sun was a hammer, and the dust of the Sonoran a fine red powder that worked its way into everything. It settled in the creases of Evelyn Hart's linen duster, coated her tongue, and filmed the very air she breathed. Through the rocking window of the stagecoach, she watched the landscape shimmer, a world of scorched earth and skeletal saguaros raising their thorny arms in surrender to the heat. Beside the rutted track, twin lines of steel glinted, the raw, unfinished spine of the railroad, pushing its way west. It was a scar on the land, a promise of progress that ended abruptly a few miles back, where the survey stakes stood waiting like patient grave markers. Evelyn clutched the brass-bound corners of the crate containing her photographic plates. They were heavy, fragile things, each one a potential truth waiting to be captured. Back in Boston, truth was a matter of polite conversation, of carefully worded editorials in newspapers that smelled of ink and money. The man she had almost married, Arthur Pendleton, believed truth was something to be managed, like a portfolio of stocks. He had called her ambition unseemly, a foolish chase after shadows. A week before the wedding, she had packed her camera, her chemicals, and the small inheritance from her grandmother, leaving behind a note on the polished mahogany of his desk. She was not made to be anyone's shadow. The coach lurched, throwing her against the worn leather seat. The driver shouted something lost to the wind and the clatter of hooves. Then came a sound that cut through everything else, sharp and final. A rifle crack. The driver's shout turned into a choked cry. The coach swerved violently, a wheel splintering against a rock, and tilted into a sickening lurch before crashing onto its side with a groan of tortured wood. Evelyn's world became a chaos of splintered timber, flying dust, and the shattering of glass. Not her plates, she prayed, her body instinctively curling around the precious cargo. She heard men's voices outside, coarse and thick with whiskey. "Check the strongbox," one of them yelled. The word slurred but undeniably English. "Garrett said it'd be a fat one." Another man laughed, a ragged, ugly sound. "Fat enough for a month of drinking. Get the woman out. We can have some fun with her before we're done." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Evelyn's shock. These were not the fearsome Apache warriors of the dime novels Arthur used to read with such morbid fascination. These were common thugs, their savagery fueled by cheap liquor and greed. She fumbled in the wreckage, her hand closing on the heavy iron skillet from her supplies. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was something. But before she could move, the world outside changed. The relentless sun vanished, swallowed by a roiling wall of brown. The wind, which had been a hot breath, became a screaming banshee, flinging sand and pebbles against the wrecked coach like buckshot. A dust storm. It descended with the speed of a striking viper, turning midday into a suffocating twilight. The men outside cursed, their voices snatched away by the gale. Evelyn huddled in the darkness, the roar of the wind a physical pressure against her eardrums. She could die here, buried in the dust, her quest for truth ending before it had even begun. Then, through the howl, a new shape appeared in the narrow slit of the broken door. A man, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible in the blinding storm. He was tall and lean, his skin the color of the red earth, his black hair held back by a simple leather band. He wore buckskin leggings and a plain cotton shirt, and in his hand, he held not a rifle, but a knife, its blade a piece of polished black stone that seemed to drink the dim light. He was Apache, the very specter that haunted the whispers of every settlement in the territory. Yet his eyes, when they met hers, held no menace. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with a calm intensity that silenced the frantic beating of her heart. He gestured for her to come, a swift, commanding motion. Hesitation was a luxury she could not afford. The coach was a trap, and the storm was a killer. She gathered her satchel of lenses and the smaller box of chemicals, leaving the heavier equipment. As she scrambled out, the man took her arm, his grip firm and steady. He did not speak. Words would have been useless in the roaring wind. He led her away from the coach, into the teeth of the storm, his body a shield against the worst of the stinging sand. He seemed to navigate by instinct, his feet sure on the treacherous ground. He brought her to a fissure in a towering rock formation, a crack barely wide enough for them to slip through. Inside, the roar of the storm muted to a low moan. They were in a narrow, high-walled canyon, a hidden sanctuary carved by water and time. The air was still and cool. Evelyn leaned against the stone wall, her lungs aching, her body trembling with adrenaline. She looked at her rescuer, truly seeing him for the first time. He was not a boy, but a man in the prime of his life. There were lines of care around his eyes, and a tension in his jaw that spoke of immense responsibility. The obsidian knife was tucked into a sheath at his belt. It was a beautiful, lethal thing, a piece of the earth itself shaped into a weapon. "Thank you," she said, her voice a raw whisper. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His gaze was fixed on the storm-choked entrance to their refuge. "The men who attacked the coach," she said, needing to make him understand. "They weren't your people. They were white men. I heard them. They were speaking English." She watched his face, expecting surprise, or perhaps a grim satisfaction. She saw neither. His expression remained unchanged, a mask of stoic control. He knew. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He already knew. His name was Keon. He had been tracking the Garrett brothers for 2 days, ever since they had raided a shepherd's camp near the reservation line. Not for supplies, but for sport. He had seen them drinking in the scrubland, waiting for the stage. He knew their purpose was not just robbery, but to stir the pot of fear and hatred that kept men like Major Silas Hargreave in command, and men like the railroad contractor, Elias Durant, in profit. Every unsolved raid, every mysterious fire, was another excuse to call for the final removal of the end day. His people, from their ancestral lands, another justification to push the iron rails through sacred ground. He looked at the woman. She was tougher than she looked. Her hands were stained with chemicals, her eyes sharp with an intelligence that missed little. She wanted to tell her truth, but her truth, shouted in the white man's world, could be a death sentence for his people. It would be twisted, dismissed as a lie, or worse, used as proof that the Apache were now colluding with outlaws. The army would not hunt for 2 drunkards named Garrett. They would come for the Chiquin. They always did. He thought of his younger brother, Itza, not killed by a bullet but by a white man's sickness in the crowded, fetid air of the San Carlos camp. The memory was a constant, cold weight in his chest, a reminder of the cost of trusting, of being powerless. He carried the responsibility for his people now, a burden as sharp and heavy as the obsidian knife passed down from his grandfather. "In this land," Keon said, his voice low and raspy from the dust, "a lie travels faster than the truth on a telegraph wire." Evelyn stared at him, understanding dawning in her tired mind. He would not help her. He could not. His silence was its own form of shield, a defense against a world that had already judged him and his people. A chasm opened between them in that small, sheltered space. She was a journalist, a photographer. Her entire being was dedicated to exposing the truth, to dragging it into the light. He was a leader, a protector, who knew that some truths, brought to light in the wrong way, could burn everything he loved to the ground. They were 2 rivers flowing from the same mountain, destined to carve different paths to the sea. The storm raged for an hour. Then, slowly, the wind began to recede. The light at the mouth of the canyon brightened from umber to a pale, hazy yellow. When the quiet finally fell, it was absolute. Keon moved to the entrance and looked out. The world had been remade, the landscape scoured and smoothed by the wind. The wrecked coach was half buried in a new dune of red sand. There was no sign of the would-be robbers. He turned back to Evelyn. "Red Butte is that way," he said, pointing east. "Walk with the sun at your back until evening. You will see its lights." He offered no escort, no further words, with a final, lingering look that held a universe of unspoken conflict. He slipped out of the canyon and vanished into the rocks, becoming one with the shadows and the ochre earth. Evelyn was alone. She checked her supplies. A canteen of water, a small bag of dried biscuits, her lenses, and her chemicals. The camera itself was still in the coach. She would have to go back. As she struggled through the deep sand, she saw that the strongbox had been broken open, its contents scattered. But her largest crate, the one holding her bulky camera and her precious glass plates, was miraculously intact, cushioned by the sand. It took all her strength, but she managed to wrestle it free, burdened and exhausted. She began the long walk toward Red Butte. She arrived just after dusk, a dust-caked wraith dragging her life's work behind her. Red Butte was not much of a town, a single dusty street lined with raw lumber store fronts, 3 saloons, a general store, and a small adobe building with a sign that read Territorial Ledger. A curl of smoke rose from its chimney. Hope, fragile but persistent, flickered in her chest. She pushed open the door. A harried-looking man with ink stains on his fingers and spectacles perched on his nose looked up from a printing press. He was about to tell her they were closed when he took in her appearance. "Good Lord, woman. What happened to you? Did you walk through hell itself?" "Something like it," Evelyn said, her voice cracking. "The stage was attacked. A dust storm—" She took a deep breath, pushing aside her fatigue. "My name is Evelyn Hart. I'm a writer and a photographer. I believe you were expecting me." The editor's eyes widened. He had been corresponding with an E. Hart for weeks, assuming the initial stood for Edward or Ephraim. A woman journalist. Here it was unheard of. But as he looked at the grit in her eyes and the determined set of her jaw, he saw something more than a lost Eastern lady. He saw a story. And out in the darkening desert, under a blanket of stars so bright they seemed to tear holes in the sky, Keon watched the distant, faint glow of Red Butte. He knew the woman would tell her story, and he knew that her truth, like the coming railroad, would change everything, whether for good or for ill. Not even the stars could say. The sharp, clean scent of ether and collodion became Evelyn's world. In a windowless storeroom behind the Territorial Ledger's office, she had constructed a dark room, a sanctuary of shadow and chemical magic. Here, under the safe, dim glow of a red lantern, the brutal glare of the Arizona sun could be tamed. Here, truth could be coaxed from its hiding place onto a sheet of glass. She moved with practiced economy, pouring the viscous liquid over a plate, sensitizing it in a bath of silver nitrate, the process a delicate, timed dance. Her lodgings were at the boarding house run by Rosa Mendez, a woman whose spirit was as resilient and sharp-edged as the landscape itself. Rosa, a widow whose husband had been lost in a mining dispute years ago, navigated Red Butte with a wry intelligence and an unflinching gaze. She brought Evelyn a cup of coffee one morning as she cleaned her lenses at the dining table. "You are making ghosts, eh?" Rosa said, her accent a warm blend of Spanish and sun-baked English. "Trapping people's souls in your little glass boxes." Evelyn smiled. "Polishing a brass lens fitting? I only capture the light they leave behind. It's the light that tells the story, not me." "Light, shadows, it is all the same. In Red Butte, the shadows have more to say." Rosa gestured with her chin toward the street. "You have met our important men." "I've mostly been acquainting myself with dust," Evelyn admitted. "The dust is the least of it. There is Major Silas Hargreave at the fort. He fought in the Great War, they say. A hero. Now his heart is as hard as the Malpais rock. He sees order as a thing you beat into people. And then there is Mr. Elias Durant of the railroad. He is smooth, like a river stone, but a river can drown a man just as quick as a bullet. Evelyn spent the next few days capturing the town's portrait. She photographed the sun-bleached facade of the general store, the blacksmith hammering a horseshoe in a shower of sparks, the rows of nameless wooden crosses in the small cemetery. Her camera, a heavy wooden box on a tripod, was an object of immense curiosity. Children followed her, and saloon patrons stared, but her focused, no-nonsense demeanor kept most of them at a respectful distance. Her lens was an impartial witness, recording the tired hope in a miner's eyes and the knot of weathered rope on a hitching post that looked unnervingly like a hangman's noose. Near a small adobe church, she met Father Miguel, a priest whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and whose eyes held a deep, abiding sorrow. He was tending a small garden of hardy peppers. "A machine to make memories," he said, looking at her camera. A heavy burden to carry. He introduced her to a young Apache girl who was helping him water the plants. "This is Neela. She is a student of your language." The girl, Neela, looked at Evelyn with bright, inquisitive eyes. She was perhaps 16, with a quiet dignity that seemed far older. She spoke a few halting words of English, her voice soft. Evelyn felt an immediate connection, a sense of a keen mind at work behind the shy exterior. Her work did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, as she was packing her equipment, a uniformed figure cast a long shadow over her. Major Silas Hargreave was a man built of straight lines and rigid posture. His uniform was immaculate despite the dust, his gray mustache trimmed with military precision. "Miss Hart," he said. His voice was gravelly, accustomed to command. "I admire your industry, but this is a harsh place for ideals." "Truth isn't an ideal, Major. It's a foundation," Evelyn replied, meeting his gaze. He offered a thin, mirthless smile. "Foundations can be built on sand out here. I've seen men, good men, swallowed by this land because they saw what they wanted to see, not what was right in front of them. Be careful the stories you choose to chase. A woman from the East, alone. Don't let your ambition get you killed." The warning was delivered with the calm finality of an order. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving a chill in the hot afternoon air. The next invitation was far more cordial. Elias Durant sent a note, requesting her presence for dinner at the town's only hotel. He was the opposite of Hargreave in every way. Dressed in a fine wool suit that defied the heat, he was handsome, charming, and his words flowed like expensive wine. "Your work is remarkable, Miss Hart," he said over roast beef and canned peas. "You capture the very soul of this place, the struggle, the potential. It's the narrative of progress itself." He spoke of the railroad not as a business venture, but as a crusade. It would bring civilization, medicine, law. It was the artery that would pump life into the heart of the territory. "The natives, of course, they don't see it that way," he said with a sigh of practiced sympathy. "They cling to the past. It's a tragedy, but an inevitable one, like a river carving a new course." Then came the purpose of the meeting. "I believe the story of this great endeavor needs to be told correctly," he said, leaning forward, "by someone with your talent and integrity. I would be honored if you would consider a position as a communications consultant for the railroad. Your role would be to document our progress, to shape the public's understanding of this vital work. The compensation, I assure you, would be more than generous." It was a bribe, wrapped in silk and tied with a ribbon of flattery. He wanted to purchase her lens, to own the light she captured. "Mr. Durant," Evelyn said, placing her napkin on the table, "my camera tells the truth as it sees it. It is not for hire to tell fairy tales." Durant's smile tightened just a fraction. "A pity. The truth is often a matter of perspective." The town council meeting was held in the back room of the largest saloon. The air was thick with the smoke of cheap cigars and the sweat of anxious men. Evelyn sat in a corner, her notebook open. Elias Durant spoke first, his voice reasonable, persuasive. He spoke of recent attacks, of the danger to settlers' families, framing the presence of the Sekin as a constant, unpredictable threat. For the safety of everyone, he concluded, for the secure future of Red Butte, a managed relocation is the only humane and logical solution. Major Hargreaves spoke next, his words clipped and devoid of emotion. My orders from Washington are becoming clearer by the day. The territory must be secured for settlement and commerce. If the Apache cannot be pacified, they will be contained. My patrols are stretched thin. Another incident, and I will have no choice but to act decisively. He did not look at anyone in particular, but his message was a clear threat aimed at the unseen people in the hills. Frustration burned in Evelyn's throat. They were talking about people's lives as if they were pieces on a game board. She thought of Neela's intelligent eyes, of the silent man who had saved her from the storm. She had to know more. She had to see beyond the walls of this smoke-filled room. The next day, she saw a cavalry patrol ride out from the fort, heading north into the foothills. On impulse, she gathered a small satchel with her handheld camera, a canteen, and a few dry plates, and followed them on foot, keeping her distance. It was a foolish, reckless thing to do. The sun was merciless. The terrain was a treacherous mix of loose rock and thorny brush. After 2 hours, she was exhausted and questioning her sanity. She found a high point, a ridge overlooking a dry wash where the soldiers had stopped to rest their horses. As she raised her camera, the sun glinted off the brass lens. Down below, a soldier's head snapped up. Hear that? Another soldier squinted in her direction. Just a rock slide. But the first man was already starting to climb the ridge. Panic seized her. She was trespassing, spying on a military patrol. They would arrest her, confiscate her equipment. She turned to flee, but her boot slipped on the loose scree. She tumbled down, scraping her hands, her camera falling from her grasp. Before the soldier could get a clear view of her, a hand shot out from behind a juniper bush and pulled her into the shadows. It was Kian. He put a finger to his lips, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He had been a silent observer, watching the patrol from a much better vantage point. He waited, motionless, until the soldier gave up his search and rejoined his comrades. When the patrol finally rode on, Kian turned to her. He led her without a word through a winding series of game trails she never would have found on her own. He moved with the silence of a shadow. When they were miles away, in the shade of a cottonwood grove near a trickle of a hidden spring, he finally spoke. You hunt for truth with the clumsiness of a blind bear, he said. There was no heat in his voice, only a weary observation. You see soldiers, and you see my people, but you do not see the strings that make them dance. Then show me, Evelyn pleaded, her frustration and shame making her bold. I was in the council meeting. They want to move your people, to take your land for the railroad. They have been wanting that for many seasons. He said, this is nothing new. What is new is you. Your box that captures light. He looked at her, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were looking straight through to her soul. You cannot find the truth from a distance. If you truly wish to write what is real, you must come to our village. You must eat our food and listen to our elders. You must see us not as ghosts in the hills, but as people who bleed and grieve. My cousin, Neela, will speak for you, but you will come as a guest, not a hunter of stories. You will come and see with your own eyes. Then you may write your truth. The offer hung in the air between them, a challenge and a lifeline. That night, back in the safety of her dark room, Evelyn developed the plates from her days in town. She watched the images emerge like memories surfacing from a deep pool. The blacksmith shop, the face of Father Miguel, and then a plate she had taken of the railroad yard. The image was dark, taken in the late afternoon. As the details resolved in the chemical bath, she saw it. In the deep shadow cast by a freight car, the blurry figure of a man was visible. He was leaning against the car, smoking. He was too far away to see his face clearly, but on his vest was a glint of metal. She held the plate closer to the red lantern. It was a small badge, the unmistakable shape of the crossed hammers that was the insignia of Durant's Railroad Company, and the man's posture, the lazy, arrogant slouch, sent a jolt of recognition through her. It was one of the men who had attacked the stagecoach. She stared at the wet glass plate, the water dripping from its edges like cold tears. The connection was there, captured in silver and light. The railroad, the violence. Rosa's words echoed in her mind. A river can drown a man just as quick as a bullet. She now held the proof, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this proof, this small piece of truth, was the most dangerous thing in all of Arizona. Neela met her at dawn, a solitary figure waiting by a twisted mesquite tree that marked a path unseen by any but the Tsakin. She led Evelyn not up into the high mountains, but down, into a winding network of canyons and arroyos that folded into the earth, a secret geography of survival. The entrance to the village was no grand gate, but a narrow passage between two sheer rock faces, easily overlooked and easily defended. Inside, the world changed. The raw, exposed hostility of the desert gave way to a sheltered valley where a ribbon of spring water, shaded by ancient cottonwood trees, gave life. Dwellings made of bent branches and hide were scattered amongst the trees, smoke from their fire pits rising in thin, clean lines into the morning air. It was a place of profound peace, yet Evelyn could feel the watchfulness. Eyes followed her from the shadows of doorways. Old men paused their conversations, and children stopped their games to stare at the white woman with the strange boxes. Kian emerged from a larger dwelling as she and Neela approached. He carried no weapon, and his face was unreadable. "You are welcome in my grandmother's home," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the clear air. He then looked at her, his gaze direct and heavy with meaning. "Remember what I said. We are not myths from your dime novels. We are people. Watch with your heart, not just your eyes." The days that followed were an immersion in a world Eve had only ever read about, and the reality was both simpler and infinitely more complex than any book had described. She sat quietly in a corner, her notebook in her lap, as a woman with hands as gnarled as roots used herbs and a soft, rhythmic chant to soothe a child's fever. She learned that every drop of water from the spring was a shared treasure, its use governed by unwritten laws of need and respect that made the squabbles in Red Butte seem childish. In the evenings, an elder would tell stories by the fire, his voice a gravelly cadence that wove tales of the creation of the world, of Coyote's foolishness, and of the heroes who had defended their people. The stories were not entertainment, they were history, law, and scripture all at once, a living tapestry of collective memory. Neela sat beside her, translating in a whisper, and sometimes Evelyn would try to repeat a word in the Ende language, her clumsy pronunciation earning gentle, amused smiles. It was a soft, kind laughter that made her feel less like an intruder. She resisted the urge to bring out her camera. She was a guest, not a collector of exotic images. She was acutely aware of the line between documenting and exploiting, a line she had sworn to herself she would never cross. Her purpose here was to understand, not to take. Neela, however, was fascinated by her world. She would shyly look at the books Evelyn had brought, her fingers tracing the printed words. She asked about the cities in the east, about the great buildings and the machines that ran on steam. She was most curious about the camera. "It holds light," she asked one afternoon, her English growing more confident. "It makes a memory that does not fade." "Yes," Evelyn said, "it remembers exactly what it sees." "I would like to learn that," Neela said, a quiet determination in her voice, "to make memories of our people that the wind cannot blow away." One morning, Neela led Evelyn to a wickiup where an old woman sat weaving a basket, her fingers moving with a slow, arthritic grace. Her face was a beautiful ruin, her eyes clouded with age but still holding a spark of fierce intelligence. It was Kian's grandmother. Evelyn watched her for a long time. the sunlight from the doorway illuminating the intricate map of wrinkles on her hands. They were hands that had planted corn, ground mesquite beans, held babies, and mourned the dead. They were the hands of the Tsikin. "Through Neela," Evelyn asked, her voice full of deference, "may I make a picture? A memory of your hands?" The old woman looked at Evelyn, her gaze penetrating, as if weighing her spirit. After a long silence, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. Evelyn worked with a reverence she usually reserved for a cathedral. She set up her tripod, prepared a single glass plate, and focused her lens not on the woman's face, but on her hands, resting in her lap amongst the reeds of the unfinished basket. The click of the shutter was loud in the quiet hut. Later, as Evelyn was cleaning the plate, Kian found her by the spring. He had seen the photograph. He stood for a moment, watching the image of his grandmother's hands appear as if by magic from the milky chemicals. "Those hands," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he did not try to hide. "They remember the years of peace. They also remember the night the soldiers came. Not to fight. They came with papers from their government. They rounded us up to be moved to the reservation at San Carlos, to make sure we would not return. They set fire to our winter stores, all the corn, all the beans we had grown and saved. They burned it while we watched." He looked away toward the far wall of the canyon. "Many did not survive that winter. We starved. We fell to sickness. My brother was one of them. The white men's progress is built upon our ashes." The story settled in the space between them, a cold, heavy truth. Evelyn finally understood the depth of his mistrust, the source of the sorrow in his eyes. He was not just fighting for land or water. He was fighting against the erasure of his people's memory. She finished washing the plate and held it up. The image was perfect, sharp and profound. The story of a people was etched into the skin of those two hands. Kian's grandmother came to her that evening. She did not speak, but she held out a small, leather pouch. Inside was a simple bracelet of polished turquoise stones, the color of a summer sky. She took Evelyn's wrist and tied it on. Then she pointed to the glass plate, and then to her own heart. It was a trade, a memory for a memory, a gift of trust. Evelyn knew then what she had to do. The story of Red Butte was not about the railroad, or the soldiers, or the outlaws. It was about this quiet dignity, this fierce will to survive. She would write it, not as a single article, but as a series, a 3-part investigation that would lay bare the truth she was uncovering. Her journalistic instincts, however, still had questions. Kian. She asked him one night by the fire. The men in town. They speak of Apache raids from last year, raids on supply wagons, on prospectors' camps. Kian poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the immense, star-filled darkness. "They speak of raids," he said. "They do not speak of the new fences Durant's surveyors put up, cutting us off from the summer grazing lands. They do not speak of the prospectors who fouled the water hole in the western foothills, leaving a dozen of our horses to die. They call it a raid when we take back what was stolen from us. When a man is starving, is it a crime to take a loaf of bread from the man who burned his harvest? They call us savages, but they forget what they did to make us desperate." His logic was as sharp and unyielding as the obsidian knife at his belt. The night before she was to leave, Evelyn sat in her borrowed dwelling, reviewing her notes. She had a small, hand-drawn map of the area that Neela had helped her make, marking the location of the spring, the village, and a small, quiet grove of junipers on a nearby mesa. Neela had called it the place of sleepers, the village burial ground. For her articles, Evelyn wanted to be precise. She unrolled a copy of a territorial survey map she had bought in Prescott, a map that showed the proposed route of Elias Durant's railroad. She spread it out on the dirt floor, holding it down with rocks. She traced the projected path of the steel rails, a bold line cutting across the paper landscape. Her finger moved across the grid, past the landmarks she recognized, and then it stopped. A cold dread, heavy and sickening, washed over her. She checked her own hand-drawn map, her heart pounding. There was no mistake. The bold, straight line of the railroad, the great artery of progress and civilization that Elias Durant spoke of with such passion, ran directly through the quiet grove of junipers on the mesa. It cut right through the heart of the Tsikin burial ground. Progress did not just have a price. It had an appetite, and it was preparing to feast upon the dead. Evelyn returned to Red Butte with a quiet, cold fury simmering beneath her skin. The photograph of Durant's man at the rail yard and the knowledge of what lay in the railroad's path had transformed her mission from one of documentation to one of intervention. She began writing, the words flowing onto the page with the sharp clarity of a freshly developed plate. The first part of her series was a portrait of the town itself, a place of tenuous hope and simmering resentments. But she wove in the subtle threads of the railroad's influence, the long shadow it cast over every transaction and conversation. The fuse was lit 2 days later. News came down from the Silver Creek mine, garbled and frantic. An explosion in a storage shed, a fire, and 2 prospectors found dead. Before a proper investigation could even begin, a narrative took hold, spreading through the saloons like a fever. It was an Apache raid. The story was fueled by whispers and stoked by men who seemed to have an endless supply of free whiskey. By sundown, the fear in Red Butte was a tangible thing. Elias Durant stood on the steps of the hotel, addressing a small, angry crowd. He was the picture of civic concern, his voice laced with sorrow. He spoke of the dangers of the frontier, the need for security, and the tragic reluctance of the natives to accept the march of progress. He did not have to point fingers. The crowd did it for him. At the fort, Major Silas Hargreave needed little persuasion. The incident gave him the justification his superiors in Washington had been waiting for. He unrolled a map on his desk, his finger jabbing at the territory that encompassed the Tsikin village. "It is no longer a matter of pacification," he announced to his junior officers and to the town's deputy. "Tom O'Rourke, it is a matter of containment. I have the authority. We will begin a systematic collection of all non-treaty natives in this sector. They will be escorted to San Carlos for their own safety and for ours." Deputy Tom O'Rourke, a young man who still believed the badge on his chest stood for justice, felt a sour taste in his mouth. "Major, we don't have proof. The sheriff is still up at the mine." Proof Hargreaves' eyes were like chips of granite. "The proof is in 2 dead miners and a history of violence. I have my orders. Deputy, I will not have this territory descend into chaos while you search for proof that fits your sensibilities." Father Miguel, who had heard the commotion and hurried to the fort, stood in the doorway, his presence a silent rebuke. "Major, this is madness. An entire community is not responsible for the actions of a few. If they were even involved at all, this will only lead to more bloodshed. I urge you, wait, let reason prevail." "Reason," Hargreaves scoffed, "has been tried. Now, order will be imposed." Evelyn heard the verdict from Rosa, whose face was pale with worry. "They are going to do it. They are going to sweep the hills." The news hit Evelyn like a physical blow. This was Durant's plan, executed with brutal efficiency. Create a crisis, then offer the solution that served his own interests. She grabbed Tom's arm as he left the fort, his face a mask of conflict. "You cannot believe this," she said, her voice low and urgent. "You know this is a lie." "What I believe doesn't matter," Tom said, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. "The Major has the authority. He has the troops." "It was the Garrett brothers," Evelyn said, the suspicion hardening into certainty. "The same men who attacked the stagecoach. Durant is using them." Tom stopped and looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I have a photograph of one of them wearing a railroad insignia, and I know they are back in the hills. They have a camp in the old box canyon. If we could prove they were at the mine." A flicker of his earlier idealism returned to Tom's eyes. He was a lawman, and the law was being twisted into a weapon. The major would never authorize me to investigate them. Not now. Then we go without his authorization, Evelyn said, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. You and I, tonight, you as a lawman, and me as a witness. That night, under a sliver of moon, they rode out, not as a journalist and a deputy, but as two conspirators chasing a dangerous truth. Tom led them through the Badlands with a quiet competence, his senses on high alert. They left their horses tethered in a ravine and approached the box canyon on foot. They could smell the campfire and hear the low murmur of voices. Peering over a rocky ledge, they saw them, the Garrett brothers and two other men, passing a bottle around a fire. Near the back of the canyon stood a dilapidated explosives shed, a relic from a failed mining claim. A heavy wagon was parked beside it, its canvas cover pulled tight. "That's them," Tom whispered, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "But we have no proof they were at the mine." "The proof might be in the wagon," Evelyn whispered back. She had brought her smaller camera and a portable dark box, a heavy, awkward burden. "I need to get closer." While Tom kept watch, Evelyn crept down the side of the canyon, moving from shadow to shadow with a stealth she did not know she possessed. The air was tense, the men's occasional laughter grating on her nerves. She reached the wagon, her heart hammering against her ribs. She carefully lifted a corner of the canvas. The wagon was loaded with crates. Stenciled on the side of the nearest one were the words, "Danger," "Dynamite," and below that, a smaller, fresher stencil, the crossed hammers of Durant's Railroad Company. This was it, the bullet of light she needed. She worked in frantic, whispered silence, her hands trembling as she set up the camera in the deep shadow of an overhanging rock. Preparing the wet plate was an agony of suppressed movement. Every clink of glass, every slosh of chemicals, sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. She aimed the camera, opened the lens, and began to count, praying for the faint moonlight to be enough. A shout from the campfire made her freeze. One of the men was getting up, walking toward the shadows near the wagon. She capped the lens, grabbed the plate holder, and scrambled back into the darkness of the rocks, her lungs burning. She did not know if the image had taken. She did not know if she'd gotten away unseen. As she and Tom rode back toward Red Butte, the sky to the south began to glow with an unnatural orange light. A deep, primal fear seized Evelyn. "That's the direction of the town," she said. They spurred their horses, arriving to a scene of chaos. It was the boarding house. Rosa's home and business was engulfed in flames, the fire eating the dry timber with a terrible hunger. A bucket brigade was making a futile effort to stop it. Evelyn found Rosa standing across the street, wrapped in a blanket, her face streaked with soot and tears, watching her life turn to ash. "It went up so fast," Rosa choked out, her voice raw, like someone wanted it to burn. She clutched Evelyn's arm, her eyes wide with a new horror. "My ledger book, Eve. It was in the office. All my accounts. The money Durant owes me. The money he owes half the merchants in this town. Proof of how deep his roots of debt go. It's all gone." The fire was not an accident. It was a calculated act of destruction, silencing the one person who held the paper trail of Durant's influence. All Evelyn had now was a fragile piece of glass with a ghost of an image on it. Miles away, in the secret canyon of the Tsekin, a young man named Taza met with one of the Garretts in a moonless grove. Taza's family was sick, and he was desperate. The Garrett man offered him a deal, his words smooth and tempting. "The soldiers are coming," the outlaw said. "They'll take everyone to the reservation, where the water is bad and the sickness spreads. But there is another way. We know of a spring, farther north, clean water, enough for a family to survive. Just tell us where your people are hidden. Tell us the way to your secret spring, and we will make sure you and your family are warned before the soldiers come. We will give you a new start." Taza looked at the waterskin the man offered, a promise of life in a dying land. torn between loyalty to his people and fear for his family. He made a choice born of despair. He spoke, and the secret that had kept the Tsekins safe for generations was given away. The news of Hargreaves' order reached Kian by mid-morning. Carried by a scout who had risked his life to listen at the edge of the fort, there was no time. The soldiers would move quickly. Panic was a spark that could quickly become a wildfire. Kian gathered the elders, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the cold dread in his own heart. A plan was made. The women, the children, and the oldest of the elders would leave immediately. They would travel by night to a second, even more remote sanctuary in the high mountains, a place known to only a few. Kian and the warriors would stay behind, a visible target to delay and distract the soldiers, to buy time for their families to escape. Back in her dark room, Evelyn's hands shook so badly she almost dropped the glass plate. She slid it into the developer, her breath held tight in her chest. An image slowly began to form. It was dark, grainy, but unmistakable. The crates of dynamite, and the railroad logo, stark and clear. She had her proof. A sharp knock on the door made her jump. It was Tom. He looked pale, his face grim. "You have to get out of here. Eve," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "Now." "What is it? What's happened?" Durant was with the major. He told him you'd been seen stirring up trouble, meeting with the Apache. He's twisted everything. He's telling them you incited the riot at the mine. Tom took a deep breath. "Major Hargreaves just signed a warrant for your arrest, for sedition and inciting a riot. They're coming for you." Evelyn stared at him, the world tilting on its axis. The photograph in her hand felt impossibly heavy. It was the truth. It was proof, and it had just made her a fugitive. She was no longer a chronicler of the hunt. She was now the prey. Tom's warning was a bell tolling a second too late. Before Evelyn could fully process the danger, the door to the newspaper office burst open. It was not a chaotic mob, but the cold, disciplined force of the United States Cavalry. 2 soldiers, their faces impassive, stepped inside, rifles held at a ready position. Behind them, filling the doorway, was Major Silas Hargreaves. His eyes swept the small, cluttered office, dismissing the printing press and stacks of paper before landing on Evelyn. He held a folded document in his gloved hand. "Evelyn Hart," he said, his voice flat and official. "By the authority of the United States Army and the Territorial Government of Arizona, you are under arrest for the crimes of sedition and inciting a riot." Panic flared in Evelyn's chest, hot and sharp, but she fought it down with a surge of cold anger. She had just a moment, the glass negative. Her one piece of tangible proof was still lying in the final washing tray. With a deliberate, almost casual movement, she picked it up, ostensibly to move it to a drying rack. As she turned her back to them, she slipped the still damp plate between the pages of a thick book of poetry on her shelf, a book whose spine was already warped and water-stained. "This is absurd," she said, turning back to face him, her hands empty. "I have incited nothing. I have only reported the truth." "Your truth has coincided with explosions and dead men," Hargreaves stated. "You will come with us? A wagon is waiting to escort you to the holding cells at the fort." The soldiers moved to take her arms, but she stepped back. "I will walk on my own." As they escorted her out into the harsh sunlight of the street, a small crowd gathered. She saw Rosa's face, etched with fear and fury. She saw Father Miguel, his hand gripping the cross around his neck, and she saw Tom O'Rourke, standing by the sheriff's office, his expression a miserable portrait of a man trapped between his conscience and his duty. Her eyes met his, and in that brief, silent exchange, a decision passed between them. The journey to the fort was short, but the wagon ride felt endless. Evelyn sat on a hard bench in the back of a canvas-topped supply wagon. 2 soldiers opposite her, their rifles resting across their knees. They were not unkind, merely indifferent. cogs in a machine they did not question. The wagon rumbled through the familiar landscape of scrub and rock, a landscape that now felt like the walls of a closing prison. They were in a narrow cut between two mesas when it happened. There was no warning shot, no war cry. The first sign of trouble was a sudden, sharp crack as the front axle of the wagon shattered, splintered by a single, well-aimed heavy rock dropped from the rim of the canyon above. The wagon lurched violently, tipping to one side with a scream of tortured wood and throwing the soldiers into a heap. Before they could untangle themselves, figures dropped from the rocks on both sides of the trail, moving with a silent, coordinated swiftness that was more like the flow of water than the movement of men. It was Kian and a half-dozen of his warriors. They were not painted for war. Their faces were grim, their movements economical and precise. They did not strike to kill. One warrior sliced the harnesses of the led horses, slapping their rumps and sending them galloping away down the trail. Another disarmed the two soldiers in the wagon with a speed that left them blinking in disbelief. Kian himself pulled open the back flap of the wagon and faced Evelyn. He simply offered a hand. She took it without hesitation and scrambled out. Major Hargreave, who had been riding escort a few yards ahead, had drawn his pistol, but two warriors were on him before he could fire a shot. One knocked the gun from his hand while the other pulled his arms behind his back. The entire ambush was over in less than a minute. The soldiers, including the major, were efficiently bound with their own leather belts and rope. Kian walked over to the bound major. "These men will be found before morning," Kian said, his voice low. "They are unharmed." He looked at Hargreave, and for a moment, the leader of the Tseken and the commander of the fort faced each other not as combatants, but as two men on opposite sides of a chasm. "This act will bring the entire army down on you," Hargreave said, his voice tight with fury. "The army is already coming," Kian replied. He turned to Evelyn. "Why did they take you?" "Because of this," she said, quickly explaining the photograph of the dynamite wagon. As she spoke, she saw Hargreave's expression change. He had not known about the photo. His arrest had been based solely on Durant's accusations. Kian nodded, a grim understanding on his face. He looked at his warriors and then at the disarmed soldiers. "We leave them," he commanded. To Evelyn, he said, "Killing them makes their comrades into vengeful enemies, and a dead witness cannot speak the truth." He paused. "Your truth has now become our fight as well." They melted back into the rocks, leaving the soldiers tied and helpless in the silent canyon. Kian led Evelyn on a difficult, circuitous path, ending hours later in a hidden encampment, a temporary refuge in a deep, wooded ravine. A small fire burned, shielded by an outcropping of rock, and waiting there, their faces illuminated by the flickering light, were Rosa, Tom, and Neela. It was a council of outlaws. Rosa, who had lost her home and her livelihood. Tom, who had finally cast off his badge, leaving it on the sheriff's desk with a note of resignation. Neela, her young face set with a fierce determination, having guided Rosa and Tom to this meeting place, and Evelyn, now a fugitive from the very law she had sought to uphold. "They took your plate," Tom said, his first words to her. "No," Evelyn said, a small spark of triumph in her voice. "I hid it, but Hargreave saw it. I think he believes me." "Belief is not enough," Rosa said, her voice hard. "Durant has the major's ear and the town's fear. We have nothing but our word against his." "We have the truth," Evelyn countered. "We just need to force people to see it. That wagon of dynamite was brought in on the railroad. There has to be a record, a bill of lading, a shipping ledger in the depot office." Tom's head came up. "The depot. I know the night watchman's schedule. He makes his rounds every 2 hours, and he keeps a bottle in the freight master's desk." A desperate, audacious plan began to form in the firelight. They were a tiny, fractured alliance against a powerful man and a federal system, but they had knowledge. Tom knew the town's weaknesses. Rosa knew Durant's business. knew he was overextended and reliant on the railroad's credit. Neela was their connection to her people, providing intelligence on the army's movements. Kian was their strategist, his mind sharp and accustomed to fighting a more powerful enemy. "The soldiers are moving on my village," Kian stated, his voice cutting through the discussion. "The families are on their way to the high sanctuary, but the soldiers know the location of the spring. Thanks to a traitor in our midst, they will follow the water. We are running out of time. My warriors and I will create a diversion. Draw the main patrol south, but we will need help to get the last of the families clear." The plan became two-pronged, a race against two clocks. One part of their group would break into the railroad depot in Red Butte to steal the proof they needed. The other would help guide the Tsekin to safety. As they spoke, Kian took the obsidian knife from its sheath. The firelight played on its polished, black surface. He held it for a moment, the weight of his heritage in his hand. Then he walked over to Tom O'Rourke. "You are a man of law," Kian said, "but you have chosen the side of justice. Your word is good." He held out the knife. "Handle first." Tom stared at it, his eyes wide. He understood the significance of the gesture. This was not just a tool or a weapon. It was an heirloom, a soul-deep piece of Kian's identity. "I cannot take this," Tom whispered, humbled. "You will," Kian insisted. "You will go with Neela. Help her guide the last ones away from the soldiers. We will go for the papers in the town." He closed Tom's hand over the smooth handle. "If I fall, you will see that this is returned to my grandmother. It is her memory, and the memory of her father." The pact was sealed, a silent, profound understanding passing between the Apache leader and the former lawman. 2 nights later, Evelyn and Kian slipped into Red Butte like ghosts. The town was quiet, an uneasy tension hanging in the air, while Kian's warriors created a small, noisy disturbance at the far end of town. A few spooked horses, a mysteriously toppled water trough drawing the attention of the few men on patrol. Evelyn and Kian approached the railroad depot. The lock on the office door was old and easily broken. Inside, the room smelled of coal dust, machine oil, and stale cigar smoke. Evelyn lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low. They moved quickly, searching through piles of invoices and work orders. Finally, in a large leather-bound ledger, they found it. Entries for the delivery of multiple crates of dynamite, signed for by a foreman known to be on Durant's payroll. "We have it," Evelyn whispered, a wave of relief washing over her. As she was carefully tearing the pages from the book, Kian continued to search the desk. His hand brushed against a rolled-up tube of parchment sealed with a ribbon. It looked out of place amongst the gritty paperwork. He broke the seal and unrolled it on the desk. It was not a railroad document. It was an official territorial order, stamped and signed by a federal judge in Prescott. It authorized the immediate and permanent seizure of a plot of land designated as unproductive and abandoned. Below the legal language was a surveyor's map. Evelyn leaned over, her blood running cold as she recognized the lines. It was the mesa, the juniper grove, the place of sleepers. The order was pre-signed and dated for the following week. Durant had not just been planning to build a railroad. He had been planning a conquest, sanctioned by a distant, blind law. He was going to desecrate their graves. The mission had changed. This was no longer about exposing a crime to prevent the unjust relocation of a people. It was about defending the sacred, about protecting the very dignity of memory against a machine that sought to erase it. They were no longer just running for their lives. They were fighting for their souls. They escaped Red Butte under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The wind had a malevolent edge, no longer just a hot desert breath, but a physical force that tore at their clothes and flung grit into their eyes. It carried the scent of distant rain that would never fall here, a dry, electric smell that promised only violence. Kian led them away from the town and into the labyrinth of the foothills, his knowledge of the land their only compass in the growing gloom. The storm did not arrive gently. It came as a sudden, roaring wall of sand and darkness that swallowed the horizon and erased the world. The wind screamed, a physical entity that threatened to scour them from the rock. Kian pushed them toward a fissure in a sandstone cliff, a narrow opening almost completely hidden by a curtain of ancient, wind-stunted juniper. One by one, they scrambled inside, escaping the maelstrom into a sudden, muffled quiet. They were in a small, dry cave, a hollow in the heart of the stone. It was not large, forcing them into a proximity that was both comforting and tense. Tom used a flint and steel to coax a small fire from a bundle of dried twigs Neela had gathered, its light pushing back the oppressive darkness and casting their giant, flickering shadows against the curving walls. They were a small, shipwrecked crew, washed up in a sea of sand. For a long while, no one spoke. The howl of the wind outside was a constant reminder of their isolation and their peril. Rosa sat hunched in a blanket, her face a mask of weary fury, her hands clenching and unclenching as if she could physically throttle Elias Durant. Neela stared into the flames, her young face old with the weight of the betrayal that had endangered her family. Tom, his deputy's badge now just a memory, cleaned his pistol with a slow, methodical deliberation that did not quite conceal the tremor in his hands. The stolen documents lay on a flat rock between them, a fragile testament to their crime and their only hope for justice. The ledger pages with their damning lists of dynamite shipments, and the cold, legalistic seizure order for the burial ground. The sight of it filled Evelyn with a cold resolve, but also a profound sense of despair. They were fighting not just a man, but a system, a machine of paper and law designed to grind down anything that stood in its way. As the hours wore on, an exhausted stillness settled over the small cave. Rosa and Neela huddled together, finally succumbing to a fitful sleep. Tom took the first watch, positioning himself near the narrow entrance, a solitary silhouette against the storm-choked night. Evelyn sat by the fire, the heat a small comfort against the chill that had seeped deep into her bones. She was a fugitive. The word felt unreal, something from one of the sensational stories she had always disdained. Kian had been sitting in the deepest shadows, so still he seemed a part of the rock itself. Now, he moved, coming to sit across the small fire from her. The flames carved his face from the darkness, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the deep-set intensity of his eyes. The burdens he carried seemed to press down on him, visible in the tension of his shoulders. "Your world is built of paper that lies," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's roar. He gestured toward the stolen order. "That paper gives a man the right to unbury my grandfather. My world is also built of people who believe those lies," Evelyn answered, her voice quiet. "Or who choose to believe them because it is easier. I thought my camera could fight the lies. I thought if I could just show people the truth, they would choose what is right. And now I know that the truth is not enough. It needs a defender. It needs a warrior." She looked at him, at the quiet strength that radiated from him like the heat from the fire. "It needs you." A flicker of something surprise, sorrow, a weariness too deep for words passed through his eyes. He reached across the fire, not to touch her, but to gently move a wind-swept strand of hair from her face. His fingers brushed her skin, a touch as light as a moth's wing, yet it sent a tremor through her entire being. The space between them, which had been filled with the tension of their different worlds, was suddenly charged with a different energy, something far older and more powerful than their immediate crisis. He began to speak, his voice softer now, almost a whisper, and he spoke in his own language. The words were musical, guttural, completely alien to her, yet she understood their meaning on some deeper level. Neela, stirring from her sleep, heard him. She sat up, her eyes wide in the firelight. "He is telling you of the true names," she whispered to Evelyn, her voice filled with awe. "It is a great honor. We have the names we are given to the world, but we also have a true name, a secret name, that is only spoken by those who hold our soul. It is the name of our spirit." Kian's gaze never left Evelyn's. He continued to speak, the words a soft incantation against the fury of the storm. He was unburdening himself, stripping away the layers of chief, warrior, and protector, and showing her the man beneath. He was giving her a gift of immense trust, a vulnerability that was a testament to the connection that had grown between them in the fire of shared danger. When he finished, a profound silence settled between them. The wind outside seemed to hold its breath. He moved from his place across the fire to sit beside her. The warmth of his body was a solid, grounding presence in the chaotic night. He took her face in his hands, his palms rough but his touch gentle. He looked at her not as a white woman, not as a journalist, but as if he were seeing the secret name of her own soul. The weight of the last few days, the fear, the flight, the impossible odds, suddenly crashed down upon her. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. He brushed it away with his thumb. In that moment, stripped of all artifice, they were simply two people clinging to a small point of light in an overwhelming darkness. He leaned in and his lips met hers. A kiss that was not about passion in that moment, but about recognition, a sealing of the unspoken pact between them. The world outside and all its dangers fell away, and there was only the flickering firelight, the warmth of his body, and the raw, desperate need to hold on to something real. As he held her, the tenderness of his touch was matched by a fierce, protective strength, a promise to shield her from the storm. It was a fragile, fleeting moment of peace, a desperate breath taken before plunging back into the depths. A small, trembling sound escaped her lips, a plea born of the moment's precious, precarious intensity. "Don't slow down," she moaned. The Apache chief claimed hers, fierce and tender, as he held her like forever. It was a claim not of ownership, but of shared fate. In that cave, surrounded by the screaming wind, they forged a new understanding. There were no promises of a future, no words of love spoken in a language either of them fully understood. There was only the choice, made in the heart of the storm, to stand together. They would not possess each other, for they were both too fiercely independent for that. But they would choose each other, again and again, as long as they both drew breath. Later, as the storm began to lose its fury, its roar fading to a wounded growl, they sat together, wrapped in the same blanket, watching the embers of the fire glow like a sleeping heart. Tom came back from the entrance. His watch over, he stopped, taking in the scene. He saw them not in an embrace, but he saw the way Kian's hand rested on her shoulder, the way Evelyn leaned her head against him, a portrait of quiet, exhausted intimacy. There was no flicker of jealousy in Tom's eyes, no hint of resentment. He had seen too much in the past few days to have any room left for petty emotions. He looked at these two people, a warrior who had lost his people's safety and a writer who had lost her freedom. Finding a moment of solace in a world that wanted to destroy them both, he saw not a rival, but an alliance that might be their only hope. He gave a small, weary nod, a gesture of profound acceptance and understanding. "Tomorrow will be bad," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Keep the fire lit tonight." He turned and found his own place by the wall, pulling his hat down over his eyes, granting them the privacy of his respect. The brief storm inside the cave had passed, leaving behind a new, unspoken strength. Outside, the last of the sandstorm was blowing itself out, and under the clearing sky, the stars were beginning to appear, cold and distant, witnesses to it all. The dawn that broke after the storm was unnaturally clear, the air washed clean of dust, leaving the sky a pale, fragile blue. But the peace was a lie. It was shattered by a sound that did not belong in the quiet of the desert morning, the rhythmic clank and asthmatic hiss of machinery. On the distant mesa, the one Neela had called the place of sleepers, a steam shovel stood like a monstrous, ironclad beast against the sunrise. Flanking it, small as tin soldiers from this distance, was a line of cavalry. Durant had not wasted a moment. The small band of fugitives watched from the mouth of their canyon refuge. The cold reality of the scene, a weight in their stomachs. The pre-signed order. The staged riot. The warrant, it had all been a prelude to this final, brutal act. "He is using the army as his private security," Tom said, his voice raw with disgust. "They are there to enforce a law that was bought with a lie. Then we must show the town the truth of that lie," Evelyn said, her mind already working, calculating, and we must do it now. Their plan was born of desperation and fueled by a shared, incandescent rage. They split up, moving with the calculated speed of people who had nothing left to lose. Tom and Rosa, using their knowledge of the town's back alleys and routines, slipped into Red Butte under the cover of the pre-dawn shadows. Neela, swift and silent, ran a different path, a message for her grandmother and the elders who were hiding in a temporary camp closer to the town. Evelyn and Keon went for the most crucial weapon, the hidden glass plate. They retrieved the book from the ransacked newspaper office. The plate was intact, a fragile miracle. Evelyn gathered what she could of her chemicals and a large printing frame. Their dark room would be the alley behind the railroad depot. By the time the sun had cleared the eastern mountains, the townspeople of Red Butte were beginning to stir, drawn from their homes by the distant, rhythmic clang of the steam shovel. They gathered in small, uneasy groups, their fear of the Apache now mingled with a new, uncertain dread. They saw the line of soldiers on the mesa, a clear statement of power. Then, a different kind of drama began to unfold in the heart of the town. Against the broad, windowless side of the railroad's main warehouse, a strange display was being erected. Rosa, her face set like stone, directed Tom and the town's burly blacksmith in hoisting a large, makeshift frame. Inside it, Evelyn, working with frantic precision, was preparing a colossal print, using the sun itself as her enlarger, exposing the image from her small glass negative onto a huge sheet of sensitized paper. It was a crude, unpredictable process. Photography as a desperate act of public theater. As the image began to appear on the paper, a ghostly negative at first, then slowly resolving into a stark, undeniable picture, a crowd began to form. They saw the crates, they saw the word dynamite, and they saw the crossed hammer's insignia of the railroad. Tom O'Rourke, no longer wearing a badge but standing taller than he ever had with it on, unrolled the stolen ledger pages. His voice, clear and steady, rang out in the morning air, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. He read the entries, one by one. Shipment of 20 crates, explosive powder, received June 12th, signed for by Jedediah Garrett. Shipment of 12 crates, dynamite, received July 1st, signed for by Jedediah Garrett. He read the dates, the quantities, the names, each word a hammer blow against the wall of lies Durant had built. Then, through the crowd, came a procession. Keon's grandmother, her face a mask of ancient sorrow and unbreakable dignity, walked with the aid of a simple staff. Neela was by her side, and behind them came a dozen other elders of the Tsekin. They were unarmed, their hands empty save for the ceremonial walking staffs they carried. They were not warriors come to fight. They were grandparents come to protect their dead. They stopped before the growing crowd. The old woman looked not at the photograph, but at the faces of the people of Red Butte. She began to speak, her voice thin with age but resonant with authority. She spoke in the Ndé tongue, a language of the earth and the wind, a language none of them understood. But as she spoke, Neela translated, her own voice clear and strong, bridging the chasm between their two worlds. She says that a people are not their weapons or their houses. Neela translated, her eyes locking with the blacksmiths, then the store owners. A people are their stories. Our stories are kept in the memories of our children. They are also kept in the ground, with the bones of those who came before us. The man who builds on our graves does not just steal our land. He steals our name. He makes us into ghosts. Up on the mesa, the steam shovel gave a great, shuddering hiss of steam. Its metal arm beginning to rise, Major Silas Hargreaves sat on his horse, watching the scene through his field glasses. He saw the crowd gathering at the depot. He saw the strange, huge photograph. He saw the line of elders standing before the town. His face was a hard, unreadable mask. Elias Durant rode up beside him, his own face flushed with impatience and triumph. "It is time, Major," Durant said, gesturing toward the cemetery. "Begin the clearing." Hargreave did not answer. He lowered his glasses and looked at the ground before him, at the simple, rock-strewn earth that held the graves of the Tsekin. He thought of another grave, a small, lonely one in a military cemetery back east, a grave he had not visited in years, the grave of his son, taken by cholera in a crowded, unsanitary fort not unlike San Carlos, a place where order had been imposed, but life had been lost. Major Durant's voice was sharp. "I have a legal order. Your duty is to enforce it." Down below, the confrontation had reached its final stage. Kian and the elders had left the town square and were now walking slowly, deliberately, up the slope of the mesa. They formed a silent, human line at the edge of the burial ground, directly in the path of the machine. They held their ceremonial staffs planted in the ground before them. It was their only shield. Hargreave gave an order, and a line of cavalrymen moved forward, their carbines raised. They formed a line opposite the elders, a barrier of blue uniforms and polished steel. Hargreave drew his own pistol, its barrel glinting in the morning sun. He aimed it not at Kian, but at the sky. The crowd below held its breath. This was the moment, the final, brutal imposition of order. But the shot never came. Slowly, deliberately, Major Hargreave lowered his pistol and returned it to its holster. He looked at the hard, determined faces of the old men and women who stood willing to die for this patch of sacred ground. He looked at Kian, who met his gaze not with hatred, but with a profound, unyielding resolve, and his own resolve, the rigid discipline that had been his shield for decades, finally cracked. "Lower your weapons," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying with the unmistakable weight of command. His soldiers hesitated, confused. I said, "Lower your weapons," he barked, his old authority flaring. The line of carbines dropped. Elias Durant stared at him, his face contorted with disbelief and rage. "What is the meaning of this?" "Hargreave, are you disobeying a direct order?" Hargreave turned his horse to face him fully, and the crowd below saw the movement. They saw the major turn his back on the machine and face the man who had brought it. "Your order, Mr. Durant, is to clear this land," Hargreave said, his voice cold and clear. "My duty is to keep the peace. I will not fire on unarmed men and women, and I will not, under God, fire on men's graves." A collective gasp went through the crowd below. It was a public act of defiance, a rebellion of conscience. Durant, his face purple with fury, realized he had lost control. His power, built on intimidation and the assumption of military backing, was evaporating in the morning sun. From the rocks above the scene, a figure rose. It was Jedediah Garrett, holding a rifle. He had been placed there as Durant's insurance. "If you will not do it, I will," Garrett screamed, his mind addled by panic and whiskey. He aimed his rifle into the tense standoff, hoping a single shot would ignite the chaos Durant needed. He fired, but his aim was wild. The bullet missed the soldiers and the elders. It struck Tom O'Rourke, who had run up the slope to stand with the townspeople closest to the confrontation. The bullet spun him around, and he fell to one knee, clutching his shoulder, his face white with pain and shock. The sight of their former deputy being shot by Durant's hired thug was the final spark. A roar went up from the crowd. The blacksmith, the miners, the storekeeps, they surged forward, their fear finally burned away by a righteous anger. They were no longer spectators. They scrambled up the slope, their faces set with a grim determination. Jedediah Garrett tried to reload, but he was too slow. The blacksmith was on him first, a single, massive fist ending the fight. Other men from the town surrounded the stunned and suddenly powerless crew of the steam shovel. Elias Durant saw his entire enterprise collapsing into ruin. He yanked the reins of his horse, spinning it around, and spurred it into a gallop, fleeing the scene of his spectacular defeat. Major Silas Hargreave watched him go. He then dismounted and walked over to where Tom was being tended to by Rosa and Evelyn. He looked down at the bleeding shoulder, then at the faces of the people who had defied him. "Get this man to the fort surgeon," he commanded. He then looked at Evelyn, and for the first time, she saw not an antagonist, but a man profoundly shaken, a man awakening from a long and terrible sleep. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice heavy, "it appears I will have a great deal to say in my official report. I will be your witness." The hearing room in Prescott was paneled in pine that smelled of resin and the cold, impartial scent of the law. It was a world away from the dust and desperation of Red Butte, a place of polished wood, brass fittings, and quiet. Ordered procedure, a territorial judge, a man named Everett Thorne with a face that seemed carved from oak and a gaze that missed nothing, presided over the proceedings. On one side of the room sat Elias Durant, captured in a neighboring county, looking diminished and haggard in the custody of federal marshals. On the other sat the unlikely alliance that had brought him here, Evelyn. Tom with his arm in a clean white sling, Rosa in a simple black dress, and Major Silas Hargreave, his uniform immaculate but his face etched with a new, weary humility. In the seats behind them, a silent, watchful presence, were Keon, Neela, and Keon's grandmother. The proceedings began with a dry recitation of charges and a litany of legal objections from Durant's lawyer. Judge Thorne listened with impassive patience, his fingers steepled before him. Then, he called the first witness. Evelyn did not present just a single photograph. She presented a narrative, with the court's permission. She set up an easel and, one by one, displayed the glass plates, her voice a calm, steady counterpoint to the images. She showed them Red Butte, a town clinging to the edge of the world. She showed them the faces of the miners, the blacksmith, the children. She showed them the stark, lonely beauty of the land. Then she showed them the plate of the Garrett brother leaning against the freight car, the railroad's insignia a small, damning detail. She showed them the dynamite wagon, and last, she placed on the easel the portrait she had taken in the village, the weathered, eloquent hands of Keon's grandmother. "This is the story," Evelyn concluded, her voice filling the silent room. "It is not a story of savages and heroes. It is a story of a community, a people, and the land that holds their memories. And it is the story of a lie powerful enough to burn down a home, to incite a riot, and to nearly desecrate the graves of the dead for the sake of profit." Next came Tom O'Rourke. He was no longer a deputy, and he spoke with the simple authority of a citizen who had witnessed a crime. He presented the stolen ledger pages, which were entered into evidence. He calmly detailed the shipments, the dates, and the names, his testimony weaving a tight, irrefutable net of conspiracy around Elias Durant. Rosa Mendez followed him. She did not speak with anger, but with the cold, precise fury of a woman who had seen her life's work turn to ash. She did not have her burned ledger, but she had a memory that was just as sharp. She stood and, from a small piece of paper, read a list of the debts Durant had accrued in Red Butte, the supplies he had purchased on credit, the wages he had promised and never paid. She painted a portrait of a man whose ambition was a house of cards, built on the credit and trust of the very people he sought to endanger. The final witness for the prosecution was the most powerful. Major Silas Hargreave took the stand. He did not offer excuses or justifications. He spoke with the clipped, factual precision of a military report. He recounted the pressure he had received from Durant, the carefully planted rumors, and the false intelligence that had led him to issue the order for the collection of the take-in. He then described the events on the mesa, his voice unwavering. "Mr. Durant did not want peace," Hargreaves stated, his eyes fixed on the judge. "He required a conflict to justify the seizure of land granted to him through a corrupt, pre-signed order. When I refused to create that conflict, he employed a hired gunman to do it for me. His actions were a direct threat to the stability of this territory and an abuse of the authority of the United States Army." It was over. The testimony of a decorated military officer, confessing his own error in judgment while unequivocally condemning Durant, was a blow from which there was no recovery. Judge Thorne delivered his verdict a week later. The courtroom was packed. His voice was as dry as the paper he read from, but his words reshaped the future of Red Butte. The railroad's route was nullified. The seizure order for the burial ground declared void, a product of fraud and conspiracy. The Garrett brothers, who had confessed everything in exchange for a lesser sentence, were sentenced to 20 years of hard labor. Elias Durant was indicted on federal charges of corruption, conspiracy, and incitement to riot, to be transported to a federal prison to await a trial that was a mere formality. But the judge did not stop there. "Punishment corrects the past," he said, looking out over the courtroom, his gaze seeming to settle on Kian. "But justice must build a future. The root of this conflict is not just greed, but the scarcity of a resource more precious in this land than gold water." He decreed the formation of a water commission, a body that would be responsible for the fair and equitable distribution of water from the contested springs and rivers between the town of Red Butte and the people of the Seikan. The flow would be shared, the usage monitored, the terms renegotiated with the changing of the seasons. It was a revolutionary idea, an attempt to institutionalize peace, to make justice a matter of daily practice rather than a rare courtroom victory. After the final rap of the gavel, a quiet sense of disbelief and profound relief settled over Evelyn and her friends. They had won. They had faced down the machine and it had broken. That evening, a telegraph message was delivered to Evelyn at her hotel. It was from her editor in Boston. She tore it open, a nervous excitement fluttering in her chest. The message was long. It congratulated her on her harrowing adventure and the sensational outcome. Then came the instructions. He wanted a 3-part series, just as she had planned, but with a specific angle. He wanted the story of the brave girl reporter, captured by a savage chief, the daring rescue by the cavalry, and the tragic, but necessary, march of civilization. It was a grotesque caricature of the truth, a dime novel version of the profound human drama she had lived. The final sentence was clear. "Adherence to this narrative is a condition of your continued employment. We feel this is the story our readers want to hear." Evelyn read the message twice. The life she had left behind, the world of secure employment and professional prestige, was offering her a way back in. All she had to do was lie. All she had to do was betray Kian, Silas, Tom, Rosa, and the truth she had risked her life for. She thought of Arthur Pendleton and his world of managed truths. She walked to the telegraph office, the paper clutched in her hand. She wrote a short, simple reply on the message pad. "I resign." She walked back to the hotel, feeling not a sense of loss, but a quiet, exhilarating sense of liberation. She found Rosa and Tom on the veranda, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and rose. "I am a free woman," she announced. She told them about the telegram, about her reply. "I'm going back to Red Butte. The Territorial Ledger is for sale. I'm going to buy the press. I'll start my own paper, the Red Butte Gazette and Studio. It won't be famous, and it probably won't make me rich, but it will tell the truth." Rosa smiled, a real, deep smile that reached her eyes. "Then you will need a business manager who knows how to collect on a debt. I am available." Tom, his arm healing but his future uncertain, just nodded. Every town needs a conscience. Major Hargreaves submitted his request for retirement the next day. Before he left Prescott, he met with Judge Thorne and recommended two of the initial appointees to the new Water Commission, Tom O'Rourke, for his knowledge of the town and his unwavering commitment to justice, and Neela, for her intelligence and her ability to walk between two worlds. Kian was not given a new title by any official body. It rose organically, from the whispers of his own people and the grudging respect of the townspeople who had witnessed his stand on the mesa. He was not the war chief. He was not the negotiator. He was simply known as the one who keeps his word. It was not a title of power, but of character, and in the clear air of Arizona, it meant far more. The victory in Prescott did not change the sky. The following spring, the rains did not come. The summer that followed was a season of punishment. The sun was a white fire, and the earth cracked open in a mosaic of thirsty fissures. The streams shrank to muddy trickles, and the once mighty cottonwoods along their banks began to shed their leaves, their branches brittle and gray. The water treaty, once a symbol of a new future, became a document of shared hardship. Tom O'Rourke and Neela, sitting on the commission, were no longer dividing a resource. They were rationing a prayer. They measured the spring's dwindling flow by the cupful, their meetings with the town council and the Tsakin elders marked by a grim, shared anxiety. It was in this parched, waiting world that Evelyn realized she was pregnant. The knowledge was a secret, fragile seed of joy in a landscape of dust and worry. She continued her work, her small printing press at the Red Butte Gazette a steady, rhythmic presence in the quiet town. She documented the drought, her photographs capturing the deep cracks in the earth and the worry etched onto the faces of ranchers and Apache alike. But now, she felt a new, fierce connection to this land, a primal urge to see it survive for the new life she carried within her. Her joy, however, was tempered by a gathering sorrow. Rosa, her friend and partner, the resilient heart of their small enterprise, had developed a cough that would not leave. It began as a dry hack in the spring and deepened through the summer into something that rattled her thin frame. The town's doctor, a kind but weary man named Harris, called it lung fever, a common affliction in the dusty territory. But he spoke the words with a finality that chilled them all. Rosa fought it with the same wry tenacity she had fought everything else. But the drought seemed to be inside her as well, drying her up from within. She spent her final days not in a sick bed, but in a comfortable chair on the porch of the new boarding house she and Evelyn had built, a place of clean pine and sturdy adobe. She watched the life of the town she had helped save, her breathing shallow, her hand often resting on Evelyn's swelling belly. She died on a still, hot afternoon in late summer, not alone, but surrounded. Evelyn held one of her hands, Kian the other. Tom and Neela sat on the steps, their presence a silent vigil. Her passing was not a violent tearing, but a quiet letting go, as if her fierce spirit had finally earned its rest. The loss left a hole in their lives as vast and empty as the cloudless sky. The drought broke, as it often does, with violence, not from the heavens, but from the scarred hills, the remnants of the Garrett gang. 3 men whose hatred had festered in the wake of their leader's imprisonment saw the drought not as a hardship, but as an opportunity. They blamed their ruin on the town, on the Apache, and on the woman who had captured their crimes on a piece of glass. They began a small, vicious campaign of terror, poisoning a waterhole used by a rancher's cattle, setting fire to a Tsakin foraging camp. Word reached Kian that they were planning something bigger, an attack on the main diversion pipe that controlled the trickle of water shared between the town and the village. It was an act of pure malice, designed to turn the two communities against each other in a final, desperate struggle. Kian and Tom rode out to intercept them. They knew the gang would use Cutter's Pass, a narrow, rocky defile that was the only quick route to the pipeline. Evelyn argued that she should go with them. "I am a journalist," she insisted, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. "My job is to be a witness, Kian refused at first, his face a mask of iron resolve. But he looked at the fierce determination in her eyes and saw the same spirit that had led her into his world in the first place. He relented. On one condition, she would stay back, hidden, and only observe. The air in the pass was still and heavy. Evelyn found a high perch, a small alcove in the rocks that gave her a clear view of the trail below, her small camera ready. She watched as Kian and Tom set a simple trap, a rock slide that would block the path. They waited. The silence stretched, broken only by the buzz of a lone fly. The three men rode into the pass with a careless arrogance. When the rocks tumbled down, blocking their way, they reacted with curses, not caution. Tom and Kian appeared on the rocks above them, their rifles leveled. Tom's voice rang out, clear and official. A lawman's voice, even without the badge. "You are under arrest for murder and destruction of property." He called. The outlaws responded with gunfire. The pass exploded into a chaos of ricocheting bullets, shouting men, and the terrified whinnying of horses. Evelyn's hands were steady as she worked her camera, the instinct to document overriding her fear. She captured the flash of a muzzle, the grim set of Kian's jaw as he fired back. Tom, providing cover, moved to a more exposed position. One of the outlaws, flanking their position, took careful aim. Evelyn saw it happen. The glint of the sun on the rifle barrel, the man's eyes squinting down the sight. He was aiming for Tom. There was no time to shout a warning. Acting on pure, primal instinct, she scrambled from her hiding place and threw herself in front of Tom just as the rifle cracked. Pain, white-hot and searing, tore through her left arm. The impact spun her around, and she fell against Tom, the world dissolving into a gray blur. The last thing she saw before consciousness faded was Kian, his face a terrible mask of fury, leaping from the rocks like a striking hawk. When she woke, the world was soft and gray and smelled of rain. She was lying on a bed of blankets, her arm bandaged tightly, a dull, throbbing ache radiating from her shoulder. The fighting was over. One of the Garrett men was dead, the other two captured and bound. But the cost had been high. Tom was lying nearby, his face pale as ash, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Kian was kneeling beside him, pressing a field dressing to the wound with a desperate intensity. And outside their rocky shelter, a miracle was happening. It was raining, not a violent downpour, but a soft, steady, life-giving rain, the first in almost a year. The drops hissed on the hot rocks and sent up the rich, intoxicating scent of wet earth. Kian looked at Tom, then at Evelyn, his eyes dark with a pain and fear she had never seen in him before. "We have to get him to Dr. Harris," Kian said, his voice ragged. "He will not survive the night here." With a strength that seemed impossible, he lifted Tom into his arms. The former deputy was a dead weight, his head lolling to one side. Kian settled the wounded man across his shoulders in a fireman's carry and began the long, slow walk back to Red Butte, each step a testament to his will. Evelyn, her own pain a distant thrum, walked beside him, her hand resting on his back, the gentle rain washing the blood and dust from their faces. Evelyn gave birth 2 weeks later. As the land was beginning to drink in the gift of the rain and show the first faint blush of new green, it was a difficult birth, but she was surrounded by a quiet strength. Neela was with her, her hands gentle and sure, and Kian waited just outside the door, his silent presence a wall against the world. She had a daughter, a small, perfect child with a thatch of dark hair and eyes that held the deep, calm wisdom of her father's people. They named her Rosa Ella, a name for the friend she had lost, and a name from the stars of the Unday. Her naming day was a quiet celebration of the new world they had built. In the morning, Father Miguel performed a small, simple baptism in the cool shade of the adobe church, the water a symbol of one kind of grace. That night, under a sky washed clean by the recent rains. Kian's grandmother held the baby up to the stars and the smoke of a sacred fire, and gave her the secret, true name of her spirit, a name that would be a shield for her soul. Months later. News came from the east. Silas Hargreave had taken a room in a small, quiet town near the military cemetery where his son was buried. One crisp autumn afternoon, he wrote a long letter. It was not a report or a justification. It was a confession, a conversation with a ghost. He wrote of his pride, his failures, and the terrible, hardening grief that had made him a stranger to his own heart. He wrote of the woman and the Apache leader who had forced him to see the world anew. He finished the letter, folded it, but did not seal it. He walked to his son's grave and left the letter there, weighted down by a small, smooth stone. The next day, Neela, who had been attending a new school for native children nearby, funded by a repentant Silas, visited the grave as he had quietly asked her to. She saw the letter. She picked it up and, in the quiet of the afternoon, her soft voice barely disturbing the falling leaves, she read Silas Hargreave's apology to his son aloud, her words a final, gentle act of grace, releasing his long-held sorrow to the wind. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were built on solid ground. By the turn of the century, Red Butte had grown. The railroad, its route finally rerouted a respectful distance to the south, brought new commerce and new faces. The town now had a proper schoolhouse, a second church, and houses made of brick instead of raw lumber. Yet, the mesa where the Sekin sleepers lay remained untouched, a silent, grassy testament to the battle that had forged the town's character, a windbreak of hardy junipers, planted by the town council and the Apache elders together, protected it from the wind, a living fence of respect. The Red Butte Gazette and Studio, housed in the old Territorial Ledger building, was the town's memory keeper. Its front window displayed Evelyn's photographs, portraits of newborns, wedding parties, proud ranchers, and solemn Apache elders. Her pictures did not lie. They showed the harshness of the land in the lines around a person's eyes, but they also showed the quiet dignity of survival. Her newspaper was small, its pages filled not with sensationalism from the East, but with the true stories of the community market prices, the minutes of the Water Commission meetings, a tribute to a beloved citizen, a poem about the beauty of a desert bloom. Evelyn's hands were now permanently stained with ink and silver nitrate, the marks of her trade. Her daughter, Rosa Ella, grew tall and straight, a child of two worlds. She had her mother's sharp, inquisitive eyes and her father's quiet, confident grace. She spent her days in the new bilingual school that Neela had established, learning to read English from a book and to understand the history of her people from the stories the elders told in the shade of the cottonwoods. Evelyn and Kian never married in the way the world understood the term. They did not share a house. His life was with his people in the canyons, a leader who guided them through the difficult, shifting landscape of the new century. Her life was in the town, a chronicler who fought to keep its memory true, but they lived under the same vast, unforgiving Arizona sky. He would appear at her door on a quiet evening, his presence as natural and expected as the setting of the sun, and they would share a meal and a quiet conversation. Sometimes she would ride out to the foothills, and they would walk the ancient trails together, their daughter running ahead of them. Theirs was not a love of constant proximity, but of unwavering choice, a bond renewed with the rhythm of the seasons. They had a running joke, a phrase that had been born in the desperate flight through the desert and had become the motto of their lives. "Do not slow down," one would say to the other. "The sand will cover your tracks." Elias Durant's story ended not with a bang, but with the quiet closing of a federal prison gate. His name became a cautionary tale told in the saloons, a ghost of a past the town had outgrown. The abandoned railroad survey stakes that still dotted the landscape were his only legacy, rusting reminders of a corrupt dream that had withered under the sun of truth. One cool autumn afternoon, when the light was slanted and golden, Evelyn stood in her studio. She had been sorting through her old glass plates, a task that was like sifting through the layers of her own life. She held 2 plates in her hands. One was the first photograph she had ever taken of Kian's grandmother, the portrait of her wise, weathered hands. The other was a more recent picture, one she had taken just a week ago. It showed the quiet, sun-drenched mesa, the cemetery peaceful under the wide sky, with Rosa Ela sitting on the low stone wall that now marked its boundary. She carefully hung the 2 framed photographs side by side on the wall behind her main desk. The beginning and the result, the hands that held the memory, and the land where that memory was now safe. The bell over the door chimed, and a group of children entered, their faces a bright mix of Apache, Mexican, and Anglo heritage. They were led by their teacher, Neela. She was a woman now, her youthful shyness replaced by a calm, confident authority. Her eyes were bright with the intelligence Evelyn had seen in them all those years ago. The children gathered before the photographs, their chatter falling to a respectful hush. Neela pointed to the picture of her great-grandmother's hands. She began to tell them a story. It was not a story from a book, but one she knew by heart. She told them of a time of fear and drought, of a greedy man who wanted to erase the past, and she told them of a warrior who would not fight with weapons, but with his word. She told them of the one who keeps his word, and how he stood with the elders to protect the sleepers. As she spoke, the children looked from the photograph of the hands to the photograph of the peaceful land, and they understood. Just as she was finishing, the bell chimed again. Tom O'Rourke came in, walking with a slight limp that was a permanent reminder of the day the town's conscience had been awakened by a bullet. He was grayer now, his face lined with the worries of a man who took his responsibilities seriously, but his eyes still held a familiar, wry humor. He was the head of the Water Commission, the respected arbiter of the town's most precious resource. He nodded at Neela and the children, then looked at the 2 photographs on the wall. A slow smile spread across his face. He leaned on the counter, his gaze meeting Evelyn's. "Justice, if left unwatched," he said, "will fall asleep." Evelyn smiled back, a deep, knowing smile. "That is why we have a newspaper," she replied. Under the Arizona sky, love was not framed by a house. It was a commitment to stand together when the wind rose and to put water in its proper channel. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.